2. Of the Besieged. Like some last exultation of a body in death, the laughter terminated, and a dreadful silence again ruled the top of Masada. Eleazar ben Yair was beginning to find the silence that fell upon his people something he could hear. It was as if he stood among a sea of ears, all poised, all turning slowly around and around, seeking to detect the slightest interruption in the conspiracy of listening. And as the ramp climbed even higher, he noticed how the silences were becoming more prolonged, and even when they were finally broken by some individual who refused to mute his voice, the melancholy lingered for increasingly longer spans of time. My people, Eleazar thought, are as wavelets in the wind. They respond to every influence, however slight, and the effect remains long after the force has passed. I must comfort myself in believing that, like the sea, they show a different face to the sun than lies beneath. Eleazar ben Yair preferred to consider his major perplexities in nautical terms, for prior to the Great War, a time he often thought of as another life enjoyed by another man, he had been a native of Bethsaida, a town known as the House of Fishes, on the western shore of the Lake of Galilee. There he had been a fisherman of more than ordinary repute, yet he took delight in warning others that if all the lies concerning the size of his catch could be believed, then he must certainly be the greatest fisherman since the Exodus from Egypt, which would now be 1,065 years. And maybe even longer, he would add with his inviting smile. You understand, of course, that all Galileans are fighters from the cradle, and this particular endowment applies to the fish as well as to those of us who dwell on dry land. It is for this simple reason, that only a Galilean can catch Galilean fish. All others need not trouble themselves. Eleazar's Hebrew, with its slurred gutturals, more closely resembled Syrian. But there were few on Masada who found it offensive. Even the Judeans, who were so inclined to snobbiness about the purity of their words, easily forgave Eleazar his dictional transgressions, and after moments, if he heeded him well, became lost in his message. There were many reasons for the almost immediate creation of this spell, whether Eleazar spoke to a multitude or simply to an individual. He was, in the first place, blessed with a splendid physique, being taller than most men by a palm or even two, and yet of heft and proportion to match. Like so many Galileans, he was of fair complexion, and his eyes were blue-green, as if forever stained with the colors of the sea. His strength was not unusual among the fishermen of Galilee or any other waters, and his great fingered hand might be equally exchanged with any true mariner. Some said it was his movements that were responsible for the impression that he was a man of extraordinary beauty, although even those most under his influence knew he was not. All were agreed there was something different about the use of body and limb, for even a turn or step became a maneuver of leopard grace. He knew how to put the total of his force into a pull or a push. He knew how to gesture with his big hands so they seemed to encompass the world, and he knew instinctively how best to make his stand, whether opposed by word or weapon. Even his most faithful followers admitted that his air of controlled majesty had much to do with his sometimes being called a demagogue, but they would recommend his critics ask Eleazar ben Yair himself how it was that he came to be the chosen leader of the people of Masada. Then he would tell them the truth. None of these people trust each other. We Galileans are chronic rebels against the Romans, yet I am a zealot because there is nothing else in Palestine left to be. I am neither a Sicarius, nor a Pharisee, nor a Sadducee, nor an Essene, nor even a man of strict devotion to God. I sometimes even doubt the very existence of God. He seems careless and permits me to live very temporarily, while others die all around me. So I can only suppose he wants it that way. I have with my own hand killed more Jews than most Romans, because they refuse to fight. I am a fighter, and the others know it, and that is why I am their leader. The face of Eleazar ben Yair contributed greatly to the spell which seemed to emanate from him even when he was most at ease. In the manner of his people he was unshaven, but he kept his beard well trimmed. His skin had been so tormented by wind and sun that at times it appeared metallic in texture, and it seemed that if a sword struck his cheek it would only blunt its edge. Yet, as if to reaffirm his equality with more vulnerable men, his nose had been so badly broken it seemed to spread half across his face, and his teeth were also broken and irregular. For so young a man his eyebrows were very heavy, a feature which sometimes lent him the look of a bleached Satan, and which, with full realization of the effect, he would sometimes mischievously employ to relieve the tension on Masada. His voice was normally soft, as if so often the case with men of the sea, although when addressing his zealots it took on a special resonance, as if to capture the ear of the most indifferent listener. The people of Masada found it nearly impossible to long ignore Eleazar ben Yair, whether he kept his peace or not. They were influenced by his very history, knowing that he was the last survivor of a family of fighters and martyrs. His father, who was called Josiah, having been slain by the Romans, and his grandfather, who was called Josiah, having been killed by Herod, and during the siege of Jerusalem, where Eleazar himself had fought under Simon bar Giora. 3 of his brothers had been crucified by the Romans. Though he was careful not to seem overly influenced by the savage Sicarii, he had adopted much of their thinking, and over the door of his quarters he had fixed a Sicarius banner with its defiant wording, "God alone is the Lord. Death does not matter. Freedom is all." Secretly, Eleazar cursed all the sects of Palestine. What had they brought to the Jews but division and hatred, and now chaos and agony? There were clusters of every sect on Masada, and there were many times when he despaired of uniting them. "Listen, my dear friends," he had so often admonished them. "I am nothing. I am only a sandstone in God's eye. I do not care how you worship God, and I beg you now, in our time of peril, not to care how others do. I do not care if you live by the written or oral law, or know both by heart. Be like me, or we must all die of our own quarreling. Be like me, a Jew, and only a Jew." All of this contributed to his spell. There was also the attribute of Eleazar's education, which he had obtained in his naturally zestful manner. As in most of Palestine before the war, excellent schooling was available to any youth at a price. So Eleazar satisfied his yearning by saving a fish from each catch. The fish went to his teacher, and yet even when the catch had been so light, it might better have gone to his stomach, he said. My belly can shrink and expand with my luck, but my brain cannot be preserved like a dry fig. Therefore Eleazar ben Yair was not only renowned as a fisherman, but before he was 22 he was known as a literator, which implied that he had a smattering of letters. And all of this was also before the war. Eleazar had brought Miriam, his wife, with him to Masada, and she was also of a fishing family, although there was no similar record of rebellion in her blood. Though the Zealots had originated in Galilee, she had never heard of them until after her marriage, and when told of their intentions, how they would drive the Romans out of Palestine, she simply said it sounded foolish and unrealistic. Miriam was, in the style of her people, a woman of considerable strength and large of bone and feature, which embarrassed her. Rather would she have been dainty and even fragile in appearance, and it was true that whenever she was in proximity with such a woman she became unaccountably shy and meek, as if by assuming such a pose she might make it an actuality. She was fair, even for a Galilean, and her hair, so neatly braided, caused much comment because it was the color of sand. It had been 10 years since Miriam had worn the veil over her eyes and crowned it with a wreath of myrtle, and been given in marriage to Eleazar ben Yair, the fisherman. Since those 3 days of rejoicing, she had known only total devotion to her husband, and he her. The same whether they fought the Romans or other Jews for survival, or lived in peace, a condition they had nearly forgotten. While her husband often expressed his doubts, Miriam would allow no influence to cloud her traditional relation with God. It was she who had frowned at the Sicarius banner over the door and quietly fixed a mezuzah below it, and she had made sure it contained the longitudinally folded squares of parchment with the 2 passages from Deuteronomy written on 22 lines. Miriam was always deeply pleased when visitors touched the shining metal case and then kissed their fingers. Eleazar had this to say of his marriage: "My Miriam was created just as were all other women, not from man's eye, which would have made her envious in nature, nor from his ear, which would have made her a gossip, nor from his mouth, which might have made her a magpie. God created her from man's rib, and I searched everywhere for the one missing from my own cage, until I found Miriam." At times, when he chose to tease her, he would say, "Then who should be surprised that a man who is made of soft stuff is the more agreeable, while a woman made of bone is naturally so much harder?" Now, standing on the outermost rampart, Eleazar ben Yair, the son of a rebel and the grandson of a rebel, surveyed his domain with the reborn hope of every new day. He squinted at the sun and whispered a prayer that it would become an intolerable torch by midday. The sun was hope, hurling refuge at the Romans, he thought, was only a secret signal of despair. He looked down upon the great desert which stretched to all the horizons. There beyond the plateaus to the south was the valley of Sodom and Gomorrah, which he had first considered as an area of refuge, but finally decided against. Long ago it had been a rich land, but now it was all wasted and burned. Those who believed in such things explained how the wickedness of the inhabitants had sucked a divine fire from the sky, and even to this day fruit plucked from the few remaining trees dissolved into smoke and ashes. At least, Eleazar thought, here on Masada we are victualled for many more years. The last of our fat-tailed sheep was slaughtered only yesterday, and we have only his left horn to serve as a trumpet and a memory. But we have oil and grain and dates and wine in abundance, and we have also weapons for men 10 times our number, and water sufficient even for the joy of bathing. What other besieged have ever known such luxuries? He looked down upon the wilderness surrounding Masada and saw the long line of bearers bringing supplies to the Romans from the north. They were always there, night and day, and how well he knew the route. He had come the same way from Jerusalem, with 1,000 men, women, and children, dragging themselves across the labyrinths of ravines, crumbled rocks, flint-hard earth, and everlasting thorns, sand and swirling dust. There was delirium, O leader of innocence, and pure madness to suppose the Romans would not pursue, yet for some strange reason they had not followed, and certainly that had been a miracle. So why was it unreasonable to expect another? Think, Eleazar ben Yair, think how it is already the 3rd and 20th day of Adar, and how next month will assuredly bring the heat pounding mercilessly upon the heads of the Romans, and how they will never withstand the hell of summer. Save thy breath. Let the sun scream at them. They will dissolve in their own sweat. He felt the feather touch of a small, moist hand against his own, and looked down upon his son, Reuben. Well now, little one, what are thy plans for this day? A run along the beach, perhaps? A stop to investigate a tiny crab? Or will you capsize a shell, and after examining the marvelous pattern of its swirls, be forced to make that great decision? Will you take it home to thy mother, or throw it back into the sea? Whatever you decide, remember that next year I will expect you to start helping me about the boat, and I will begin to teach you how a mullet must be caught, and show you the very best place to net fingerlings. And then, the following year, Eleazar looked away to the east and north, where he could observe a portion of Lake Asphaltius, which was called the Dead Sea. It was already shimmering in the heat, and he thought how strange it was that even such a lifeless patch of water could bring him visions of living things. For from that same water came the bitumen with which he had once chalked his boat. He looked down again at his son and wondered if Reuben would ever leave this desert tomb and sail upon the sea. How so very small he was, and still so fragile. Nor does he understand how any other human being can bear him the slightest malice. All that he has seen here is meaningless to him. He thinks the Romans build the ramp so they may come for a visit. Lord God, if you exist for all Jews, then spare him. Show me the miracle that will spare him. His face is dirty, he said softly to Miriam. I know, she said. He fell running to hear his fathers frighten the Romans. You had him feeling very sorry for them. She was silent for a moment and looked down upon the ramp. The legionaries were rounding up their charges and driving them back to work. How much longer? She asked. 30 days at the most. And then? There are many who believe we should surrender now. Not so many. There are a few worms in every keel. Her eyes told him that she was afraid, and he knew she was not afraid for herself but for Reuben. He wondered if all husbands and wives could communicate with such silent ease. He picked the boy up and held him against the sun, and while Reuben shouted his delight, he said to her, How could so happy a boy have such a gloom for a mother? Once, she said mischievously, you called me your tower of joy. Laughing, he set the boy down. "Take warning, son. Though you may learn to reeve a net which will hold almost anything, you will never equal the mesh of a woman's memory." Holding hands with the boy between them, they descended from the ramparts. At the side of the western palace, which had been Herod's principal residence, Eleazar left them and walked around the building toward the north. It was the route he followed every morning, the closing of his post dawn tour, which normally commenced at the Serpent Path Gate on the eastern side of Masada, and then continued southward along the casements where many people had made homes between the walls. Along the way, he would question the lookouts at every station, of which there were 30 and 2 between the gate and the southern tip of Masada, and he would greet those people and their children who had come with him out of Jerusalem and across the wilderness. And he knew most of them by now, so that he could call them by name, and he knew many of their children down to the several born on Masada. It was important, Eleazar reasoned, for him to listen at least shortly to every lament and complaint, of which there were invariably a great number, because if he did not, there were only the priests to give counsel, and he mistrusted them mightily. Even in this extremity, 1/10 of the jars of food, wine, and oil were marked for their consumption, and every family gave challah from their daily batch of dough. Yet the priests contributed so very little. They were too busy reading the Word of God to prepare their own food, and too busy arguing in the mikveh about the scheme of yet another ritual bath to work on the walls. They were so preoccupied praising God for things he had done long ago, they could not beseech him for help at what must be done now. Nor could their overburdened attentions be held long enough to make them good lookouts, and not one of them had the slightest skill at arms. In a moment of anger, he had once said to them, "I am God's whip. Hear now. I can help you if you will heed me. I cannot if we spend our time arguing about dimensions of temples." He had been somewhat shocked at his own words until later, when he had time to think about it. In a sense, it was true. He was daily obliged to play God, and when he failed to behave accordingly, those who accused him of despotism were the first to whirl around and call him lax in his duty. Though objections to his policies were never-ending and he had offered to step down many times, no other man on Masada disputed his leadership. Very well, then. Let the objections continue if they provided relief for frightened tongues and meant no more. And let the praying and scripture reading prevail, if it would keep terror from their minds. Now, in moments of desperation, or even exasperation, he found himself repeating to them, "Give me your strength as you would to God, each one of you, or you will certainly perish on this rock." Here now, he thought, was pure blasphemy, if anyone dared accuse him. Let them. He would remind his accusers of the greatest general the Romans had on their side at Jerusalem, and he was God himself, who allowed the Jews to fight among themselves. During his tour, he would descend to the cistern at the southern end of Masada and there solemnly examine the water level. It was a ceremony intended to impress all who watched, and he was careful to conceal his true reactions. Actually, there was water enough for 1,000 more people on Masada, and it was merely the sight of it, dropping ever so slowly in volume, that cheered him. Like our food, he mused, water was one of the very few things the god of Masada had no cause to worry about. On the southern limits of the ramparts, He would pause and study the Roman camp which stood across the chasm. It was a small camp compared to the others, and he was certain it could be overwhelmed by a determined band of men. It would be possible for such a group to descend into the chasm from the tip of Masada, and then make their way up the opposite side to the camp. And then what? Aye, there was the hole in the sail. Even if it were physically possible to lower the balance of the people on Masada to the bottom of the chasm, and then hoist them up to the conquered camp and a possible escape route, the endeavor would take too long. Once daylight had come, the Romans would be more than poised for a massacre. In spite of his convictions, Eleazar ben Yair had never been able to leave the southern citadel without again trying to envision a new route of escape. He knew that he must not permit even a moment of hopelessness to enter his mind, and lately, as the ramp mounted closer to the western gate, he noticed how many more impossible schemes he devised to cover his growing despair. From the southernmost citadel, Eleazar's inspection route took him along the western wall to the old palace, in which 300 men, women, and children now lived. They were cramped, but each family occupied the corner of a room, and most had managed to construct some kind of privacy. The beehive of activity about Herod's buildings amused Eleazar. How the old villain would rave if he could watch his present guest! He would hardly approve of their scrawling on his frescoes, or their mud stoves on his tiles, or their defecating on his terraces. What kind of god spared such people? These survivors of Jerusalem were mostly the ignobles, the connivers, and the cunning, who had determined from the very beginning to let the other man be the hero. Except for a minority of dedicated zealots, these were the people who had cowered in the ruins of Jerusalem, never to be seen during the fighting and cunning enough to eat during the famine. They had shifted from side to side, from Simon to John, before the burning of the temple, being one day a zealot and the next a conservative, whatever seemed most likely to endure. Many would have become Romans, had the chance been offered them. "You are like so many grains of sand," he had told them when they had at last arrived safely at Masada. "To survive this time you must become mortar." Now, as on every morning after his inspection, Eleazar walked to the building that had once housed Herod's officials and administrators. There would be gathered his own leaders and advisers for the daily council of war. They would review the latest accounts of stores and adjust the rationing accordingly. Disputes between sects or even individual families would be reposed and usually solved to no one's complete satisfaction. Plans were laid for new eventualities created by the Romans, and the progress of the ramp discussed endlessly. If there were any new reports from outside Masada, be they rumor or otherwise, they would be heard, and if the wine tithe for the priest had turned out to be sour, then that was heard. Eleazar had noticed that as the ramp approached nearer, there was less and less discussion of resistance strategy. Instead, the ramp and all it portended slipped behind the shadow of domestic problems which seemed to multiply with the general tension. Judas, son of Myrto, was tormenting his wife again, and her screams were keeping everyone who lived in the east wall awake. Jacob, son of Belgas, and his whole family were sick with some mysterious ailment, and would it not be wise to forbid them contact with all others? The daughter of Ardalas, son of Matthias, had been raped by Shimeon, son of Ezra, according to her family, and Shimeon had been seduced by the daughter according to his family, and the question was not whether they would marry or not, but the size and time of delivery of her dowry. And on, thought Eleazar. How could you convince people their entire lifespan was in imminent danger of terminating when they preoccupied themselves with petty futures. While the building was sometimes referred to by the sour-natured as Eleazar's Pavilion, the inference that he enjoyed its relative comfort alone was unfair. 15 families shared the structure with his own, and if they happened to be the most trusted leaders, it was because there had to be some central place where the constant problems of the community could be exposed, and the closer his aides lived, the quicker he could act. The families occupied small rooms situated about a central court, and here, amid the sounds of children playing and wives gossiping, the morning conferences were held. When Eleazar entered the courtyard, it still echoed with the laughter of his comrades. There was old Ezra, a fierce walnut of a man in spite of his 80 years. He was one of the very last Sadducee survivors, formerly a wealthy importer from Joppa, whose defiant independence predated the destruction of his native city by Vespasian. For then, dissatisfied with the translations of the Holy Scriptures into Greek, he had become a student of Philo in Alexandria, and set about writing his own version of the Pentateuch. Even now he vowed to finish the work as soon as the Romans were defeated and driven from Palestine. Ezra was holding his sides and chuckling. "It took 20 years of my life to see those Romans run. They will sink for a week." Eleazar had long ago decided he would not trade Ezra for 100 men. Not only was he wise and learned, but a fighter to the last breath. He often said that he never thought about the future, since it would come soon enough. He had fathered 8 sons and 3 daughters, all save one killed by the Romans, and yet he kept his balance. Ezra's surviving son, Heth, a powerful youth of 20, now stood beside him. The pair often provided great amusement in the evenings when they wrestled with each other, a contest the son always won, or when they challenged each other in marksmanship, the contest the father always won. In the courtyard there also awaited Alexis, a flinty, grizzled man who had been one of the very last to escape Jerusalem. He had been captured almost immediately and forced to fight in the gladiatorial games at Berytus, whence he had again managed to escape. He had been once more caught and was scheduled to fight at Caesarea Philippi, and yet, incredibly, while he was being dragged to the chains, once more escaped. This time he managed to join the Zealots, and ever since had been fondly known as the Slippery One. Eleazar valued Alexis as his most resourceful leader. There waited also Zidon, the leader of the Pharisees, an indecisive man who could be very long of wind when engaged in avoiding facts. Like most Pharisees, he momentarily expected an apocalypse, and some said he looked forward to it as a final cessation of his nerve-wracking facial tic. As always, these days he was wearing his phylactery and his talith, the blue fringes placed at the corners according to the law of Moses, and it being very broad and long in the style of the Pharisees. There also waited Esau, a Sicarius, who would as soon slay a man as spit. He was one of the few holdovers from John of Gischala's original band of zealots in Jerusalem, and was such a sworn revolutionary that Eleazar wondered if he would ever be satisfied regardless of his success in creating turmoil. He had been one of those involved in the mock trials held in Jerusalem where Jew tried Jew and killed his brother for the slightest deviation from the party line. Eleazar found it difficult to trust Esau, and there were times when he thought his own death might have pleased the man, but he was a skilled fighter and a fearless example to the others. So thought Eleazar, I will continue to sleep with one eye open and throw him over the wall at the first sign of his treachery. At least Esau seemed to have mellowed a trifle since coming to Masada. Only recently he had announced his intention of taking a bride from one of the Essene families. Had the proposal been made by any other man, Eleazar thought he might have advised him to reconsider. But with Esau involved, he could only think such a mating must bring about the greatest contrast in the entire history of the Jewish people. Here was a villain from the streets of Jerusalem taking a bride from a tribe of ascetics who abstained from wine, meat, and oil, and appeared content with their bread and salt spiced on gay occasions with a condiment of hyssop. No wonder they ate in silence. Esau, the former thief, would join a tribe of such moral purity they suffered agonies rather than relieve themselves on the Sabbath. Ah, Esau, how the final days of your life will be changed! There waited Javan and Kittim, sons of Tema. There awaited Ashur, son of Joktan, and Nimrod, son of Abram. All of these were Eleazar's counselors, and to each of them he gave a greeting. Then they gathered around him and sat on the steps of the courtyard, as was their custom. Hillel, the young priest, blessed their meeting, and even before he had finished, Alexis rose to speak. Oh, we have had a good laugh at the expense of the Romans. Oh, yes, but I say we would have done better to drop the pair of them with as many arrows. Our dung will not destroy Romans or make them go away. He turned to Eleazar and shook his fist at him. If you had given me leave, 2 important Romans would be dead this moment. Ezra interrupted by waving his hand lazily. He asked, how do we know they were important? They could have been some kind of a trap conceived by Silva. If they were really important, he would not expose them so. I could have put a bolt through Silva himself, Alexis grumbled. At that distance, I'm sure of it. Eleazar decided against rising because he wanted to save physical dominance for later challenges that might be more serious. He simply raised his hand for attention. Then took his time. Very well, Alexis. We kill Silva and a few of his aides. Do you believe the Romans would not replace Silva with another man who would then have good reason to refuse to listen to our words? For a moment's satisfaction, we would have lost our opportunity to send down dread. Very important dread. Will you not agree to that, old Ezra? Dread is the beginning of fear, and if God will grant us a truly hot day soon, and augment it with a torching wind, then Silva may have a mutiny on his hands. It would not be the first time it has happened in the legions. Do you agree that it is all so? Alexis. I may agree there have been mutinies. I may agree that there have been mutinies, but not in the 10th Legion. We are cursed with elite troops, and I know them better than any of you. Oh, I say that we do too much talking and not enough fighting. I say we sit up here like a gaggle of geese and wait for the farmers to come wring our necks. What exactly would you have us do? Eleazar asked. Here, of course, was the snarl in the line. If you would keep a weapon sharp, you must occasionally put it to the stone. And if you would keep a fighter keen, then you must occasionally let him smell blood. The Romans had provided no such opportunity. Silva, may he roast in hell after he has fried here, keeps his legionaries in check and out of range. Eleazar said patiently, obviously they are not permitted even minor forays or night raids. They are concentrated on the circumvallation with the ramp. Nothing else counts. When Alexis had been recaptured the second time,
One of the Romans beat him with the very chain intended to restrain him. The action had cost Alexis most of his teeth, which gave him an aged look far beyond his years. Yet he had been able to make light of the physical blemish ever since he discovered that by pursing his lips in a certain way he could make a whistling sound that was exactly like the hoot of an owl. Alexis made this sound now, as he frequently did when impatient with himself or others. Then he said, "I, for one, do not intend to wait here like an old woman for the Romans to slit my throat." He scratched at the folds of skin that hung like lizards beneath his throat, and Eleazar saw several others instinctively repeat the gesture. "Oh, I say to all of you, we should slip down the serpent path at night. 10 good men are all I need, and by morning I will deliver the heads of 50 Romans." Esau the Sicarius laughed and said, "Then we could heave them back down to rejoin their carcasses." Assur, son of Jocham, said, "Why bother hauling them all the way up? Heads are heavy." Hillel the priest said, "God does not like thy savage words." No one paid him the slightest heed. Eleazar studied the palms of his great hands and sighed. "Sometimes I feel I am sailing a boat before a very strong wind, and the boat is moving much too fast. If I keep all the sail, then we will soon pile up on the reef ahead. But if I lower the sail, a wave will overcome us and sink the boat. Now," he paused to be assured of their full attention, "let us suppose, Alexis, that you are extremely lucky and manage to enter one of the camps without alarming the guard. What then? Slip into one of the tents and use our Sakari knives as they were intended, and then you will slip quickly away and run back here? Is that the idea?" "Yes. Oh, you are beginning to see things my way. Alexis, I have seen things thy way all along. I also find this waiting intolerable, but not quite when I remember how badly I need you and the men who would go with you on such an expedition. The Romans sleep 6 men to a tent. Do you suppose all 6 are going to lie quietly while you find their throats in the dark? It takes only one to give the alarm, and there you are, all of you, spread out on crosses the next morning, and we will have to look at you and smell you until you finally rot away. Oh, I say no. I intend to preserve you for the day the Romans stand at the top of the ramp, and you may die then quite as readily as the rest of us." Alexis considered Eleazar's words for a moment, and then made his oil whistle to indicate that he was still dissatisfied. "Well then, what about the ramp? We watch it grow and do absolutely nothing." "What would you have us do?" Eleazar asked carefully. Now then, he thought, it might as well be spoken at last. It is better Alexis should say it than yourself, because if any of the others speak out, because once the fatal words find their way down to the very last family, as always happens, it cannot be said that Eleazar ben Yair had fathered the action just to save his little kingdom. "What would you have us do, Alexis?" he repeated, very deliberately. "We are all listening." He watched Alexis' growing discomfort, and wondered if he would find the courage to speak out. With his eyes he begged Alexis to say what they had all been thinking. Yet he saw only a man trapped and squirming for release. He saw him scratch at his head, and then discover a demanding irritation about his crotch, and while his hands were busy, not a word passed his lips. "What were you going to suggest?" Eleazar pressed. "Do you need all morning to find your tongue?" He saw Alexis' eyes fanatically searching the faces around him. Suddenly now he was not Alexis, the fierce and slippery one, but only a badly battered little Jew seeking some near place to hide. At last old Ezra broke the tension with a mighty grunting and clearing of his throat. He pushed himself to his feet and stood caressing his beard for so long. Eleazar wondered if he too had found it impossible to speak his mind. "Praise be to God," he said finally, and Eleazar thought Moses must have carried the same air of unconquerable dignity about him. "We must now all emerge from our rat holes and face the truth. The ramp is not being built by Romans but by Jews. We are all related to someone down there. We have oil aplenty to boil them and stones to crush them. It must be done. Even the Romans cannot force the dead to work." During the long silence that followed, Ezra gathered his robe about his legs and sat down. He closed his eyes and muttered a prayer, and seemed to have forgotten the others. Zidon, leader of the Pharisees, said uncertainly, "The Romans have brought more than 15,000 Jews for the labor. Let us be practical about this. We cannot kill them all." "We can, and we should," Alexis snorted. Hillel the priest shook his head emphatically. "You would kill 15,000 to protect less than 1,000? May God help you." "Stop begging God for help," Alexis answered. He held his arms wide and announced, "God is our trouble and always has been. Pray, be good, love thy neighbor, kill not, covet not, be meek, let thy camel shit on you." If God cared, he would stop the noise we hear right now, the same noise we hear every night and every day, stone against stone, grinding and thumping, and every day louder. Oh, I say, we stop that sound today. Now Zidon rose and toyed with the great wart that blossomed from his eyelid, and in so doing nearly covered his eyes with his hand so that he could easily avoid looking directly at the others. And he said in his plodding way, "I listened to the Romans, and while they spoke, I considered my children and your children, and how they will be killed if we continue to fight, and how we might live if we give ourselves up to Silva." Esau jumped to his feet and seized Zidon by the neck. "You bilious old windbag," he screamed. "You squat when you piss." Ezra and his son Heth pulled Esau away while there was still breath in Zidon. They held him firmly until his rage subsided. "Let Zidon speak," Eleazar said as coolly as he could manage. Now he would know for the first time how many of his council held secret to the thought of surrender. Zidon's eyes darted fearfully from one man to another as he moved further away from Esau and rubbed at his neck. Eleazar watched him in fascination, uncertain whether it would be better to cut him down now, wait until he could be caught alone, or simply hope that his own words would crucify him. He reached instinctively for the short Sicarius dagger at his side. His impulse was to rush Zidon now. "Well, Zidon, we are listening. If we go down to the Romans—" "Kill him!" Esau cried, lunging forward again, but Ezra and Heth restrained him. "If we go down to the Romans, we can avoid another Mount Tabor, another Gamala. Need I remind you how Vespasian and also Titus offered the defenders their lives if they would surrender? And they would not. And the Romans hurled the children of those people from the walls. Are you prepared to see this? Titus ordered to spare the temple, and we would not listen. And the temple is no more. The Romans want us. They will put us in slavery, but we will live, and our children will live." "Cut out his tongue," Esau shouted, and the plea set all the others talking at once. Esau and Javan and Kittim seemed undecided, while Assur, Nimrod, and Hillel the priest said in various ways that perhaps Zidon was taking the sensible view. Then Eleazar's voice rang out above all the others. "Silence!" It was a voice that had defied so many storms it cut through the babel like a shaft of lightning. And for a moment there was not a sound in the courtyard. Even the women and the children were affected by Eleazar's single word. There was a ghostly quiet while Eleazar regained his patience. He placed his big fist against his sword belt, and his stance was that of a seaman balancing himself against a hard wind. How very servile are your memories to fear! Some of you have apparently forgotten the forgiving ways of Titus when Jerusalem fell. Let me remind you how all of the aged and infirm were the first to be butchered. Let me remind you how all of our leaders who were caught were first scourged and then crucified. Have you really forgotten how all under 17 years of age were taken to Rome as decorations for Titus's triumph? We can only guess what has happened to them. Some of you whose memories do not leak so badly may remember how all Jews over 17 left alive were put in chains and shipped off to the mines in Egypt. I wonder how many of those people are alive this morning. Repeat to yourselves, if you dare, the names Lydda and Jamnia and what Vespasian did to those places, and Emmaus and Tephon, and Betaris, and Caphatobus in Idumea, where Vespasian slew 10,000 of our kind. Tell me now, do you deny such deeds show the sweetness of Roman mercy? Eleazar paused and studied his listeners. Their mood was obviously changing. I must anchor this down now, he thought, so it will never rise again. But let us suppose that certain individuals are very lucky and some Roman fancies you as a personal slave. And suppose some day you band together with the intention of killing your master and escaping. Are you aware it is Roman law that if one slave should kill his master, all his slaves, obedient or not, must die? Zidon said, I still believe as long as they need us, they will not kill us, and I think of our children. Eleazar speaks of the long ago. The war has been over more than 2 years. We are the only people who do not know it. Oh, I say we must not let fanatics lead what is left of us to unnecessary death, as did Simon Bar Giora and John of Gischala, who would not listen to the Romans or even to each other. Believe me, there are those who will make easy sacrifice to their hunger for power, and that offering is our blood. Oh, I thank you if we go down peacefully to the Romans, then why should they kill us or our children when they already have countless thousands of Jews easy to hand, any of whom they kill if they pleased? These are, or should be, days of peace. Let us tell ourselves that though the state may end, the spirit continues for 1,000 years. Let us accept peace and live. Now, thought Eleazar, it is too late. I should have slipped my blade into his robes or let Esau at him. Now that tricky moment when anything I might do would be approved has passed, and Zidon stands there pulling at his wart and making himself the image of wisdom by his visions of security. He spreads his poison with every gesture and word, and I must be rid of him before he has all of us kneeling to Silva. Very well, Zidon. Go. Take those who would go with you and your own family and other Pharisees who are without faith in us, to the number of 40 and no more. I bid you farewell now, because I never expect to see you alive again. Eleazar turned and started towards his quarters. I must remove myself from the presence of that man before he destroys my own faith, he thought. A revolutionary who listens to opponents is like a sailor becalmed. He may begin to drift in any direction without recognizing what is happening, and sooner or later he becomes lost. Old Ezra moved quickly after him and came to his side. "You are discouraged, son," he said. "Do not let Zidon quench your fire. The man is a dangerous fool. We cannot tolerate his kind. I am going with him." "You!" Eleazar halted abruptly. "But you are my iron fist. I cannot fight without you. Surely you don't believe that vomit about the Romans needing you?" "Of course not. But I am an old man and quite ready to die. Here I can only fight as one more man, and I promise you my appearance of strength is a fraud. I am rotten inside, and my bones are nearly petrified. I tire so quickly that minutes after the first assault I would be useless to you. But now I have thought of a scheme that suits me as it does no other on Masada. I will complement our strongest weapon, in my opinion our only one, our only chance to survive. The heat and mutiny. The Romans must be told what it is like to live below the level of the sea when the heat comes, how the heavy atmosphere will press them into the sand. I will make some terrible prophecies." "Why should they listen to you?" "Because I am old and look wise, even if I am not. I speak fluent Latin, and I know their superstitions, of which they have even more than we have. We will not pass between two dogs, pigs, or women to eat 2 eggs. Ashmedai, the prince of spirits, rules by the number 2. Crazy? How could you like to be a Roman general? How would you like to be a Roman general with your decision whether or not to fight a battle dependent on how the entrails of a chicken fall out when the bird is sacrificed? They will kill you the moment you enter the first camp." "I doubt it." "Not for a time at least, because I will start them off with my first lie and ask to be taken to Silva himself. I will tell them that we are only the advance party of surrender. We have simply come down to reaffirm the details of Vespasian's offer as presented by his messengers, an offer, incidentally, which I doubt was ever made. But I will seem to take it most seriously, which will give me time to make certain dreadful predictions before Silva. And then, when we do not come down, what then of you, dear friend?" Ezra shrugged his shoulders. "As I told you, I'm getting old."